Good afternoon, students, faculty, and community members, and welcome to the School of Policy Studies weekly speaker series, Policy Talks. My name is Stephanie Cronfley, and I'm a student of the MPA class of 2019, and it's my pleasure today to be able to host this week's Policy Speaker Series, for which we are very fortunate to have Elizabeth Goodyear-Grant and Peter Loewen here to speak with us today to discuss the U.S. midterm elections. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the Indigenous territory on which we have the privilege of meeting today. The territory Kingston sits on has been the site of human occupation for thousands of years and is the homeland of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe people. First, I would like to introduce Dr. Elizabeth Goodyear-Grant, who is an associate professor in the Department of Political Studies here at Queen's, the director of the Queen's Institute for Intergovernmental Relations, and the director of the Canadian Opinion Research Archive. Her research focuses on voting behavior in elections, political behavior, news media, and the representation of women. Dr. Goodyear-Grant is widely published, and in particular is the author of a prize-winning book titled Gender News, Media Coverage, and Electoral Politics in Canada. Today, Dr. Goodyear-Grant's talk will focus on women candidates and voters in the recent U.S. midterm elections. Next, I would like to introduce Dr. Peter Loewen, who is a professor in the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy in the Department of Political Science at the University of Toronto. He is also a fellow at Stanford University's Center for Advanced Studies in the Behavioral Sciences. His interests lie in how politicians can make better decisions, how citizens can make better choices, and how governments can develop better public policy. Dr. Loewen has published in many leading journals, regularly engages in public debate, and acts as a consultant to several public and private organizations. Today, Dr. Loewen's talk will focus on polarization, gerrymandering, and broken politics. After the presentations, we will have a panel discussion, and we ask that you use Slido to submit your questions using the hashtag MPA19. People watching via the live stream can also participate. If you don't have a question, feel free to vote on other questions that are of interest to you, and as in the past, we will pose the questions with the most votes. We will also take a few questions live from the crowd today. So please join me now in welcoming our two guests.
Okay, so thank you for that lovely welcome and for inviting me to give this presentation in the school today. So I'm going to talk about three distinct things in my presentation. So what are the patterns of women's electoral representation we see coming out of the 2018 midterms? Focusing, of course, on the pink wave, which is one of the big stories of these midterms. Why the boost in women's representation? So why we see this historic jump in representation? And then, much shorter, I'm going to offer some speculative comments on the implications for policy and governance for the next 2 years as we move into a new Congress and then the 2020 elections. So this is women's representation in the U.S. Congress from 1981 to 2018. So 2018 is still projected, but it's more or less, right? There's still a few races that are too close to call, including 4 or 5 races that involve women candidates. So up for election in these midterms were all members of the House of Representatives. They go up for election every 2 years. A third of senators, 38 state governors, and thousands of state and local elections. So beating the former highs set in 2016, at least 125 women will sit in Congress after the 2018 midterms, increasing the percentage of women in Congress from 19% to 24% at minimum. So just to put a bit of context on this in terms of what an historic or dramatic rate of growth this is, that's a 5 percentage point increase. And the last time that women's congressional representation increased by 5 percentage points was incrementally over a 16-year period or 18-year period from basically 1998 to 2016. So this is huge. In addition to the overall growth in women's proportion of seats, I want to unpack a couple of patterns that are quite notable, just briefly here. So that's the diversity in women candidates, the institutional asymmetry, and the partisan asymmetry that we see in women's seats increasingly. So, of course, one of the leading media stories about the pink wave in 2018 is the increasing heterogeneity of women members of Congress, especially racial and ethnic minority representation. And this photo here of Minnesota Representative Ilhan Omar has become, she's become a real face of that kind of change, and there are others as well. In this Congress, we had the first 2 Muslim women elected to congressional office, the first 2 Native American women elected, and many more historic firsts. So that's an important part of this story. The other part of the story, of course, is that we have 2 forms of asymmetry in growth in women's representation in Congress. The first type of pattern is institutional asymmetry. I mean, this has been an issue for a while, but it's increased after this election. So women's seat gains are solely in the House of Representatives. So that huge jump in women's representation is in the House. Women made no gains in the Senate, really. So that's the institutional asymmetry. And that's consequential for lots of reasons that I can talk about in the Q&A, not least of which is the fact that the Senate has always been looked at as a pipeline to the presidency. But there's lots of more immediate consequences to this as well. We also see partisan asymmetry in growth in women's representation. So this is showing changes in women's seats from 2016 to 2018 by institution and by party. So focusing on the 4 major types of races that we see in federal elections in the US, House, Senate, governorship, and state legislative races. What we look at if we divide by party is that women Republicans' representation is lower after the 2018 midterms than it was before them. So no gains, and in fact, net losses for women Republicans. So all the growth is concentrated among Democrat candidates who were elected to office. So what I was just saying about the House, we can see then on the far left panel the dramatic growth in the number of Democrat women who were elected to the House of Representatives. So one of the points that I want to make here around this is that while women legislators are becoming more diverse in some ways, especially sociodemographically, they're becoming less diverse in other ways, ideologically and by partisanship. And that could be concerning for a variety of reasons, some of which I'll touch on at the very end. The growing partisan divergence that we see in women elected to Congress is more obvious when we look at things over time. So looking, well, this is a very long time frame, but basically until the late 80s or early 1990s, the 2 major parties basically performed the same on electing women, which is to say sort of badly, right, on electing women to Congress. And in the early 1990s, we see dramatic growth among the Democrats to the point where gains in women's congressional representation since the early to mid 1990s are almost always at the hands of the Republican or the Democrats. And that's increased dramatically in the last few cycles. So explaining the pink wave, right? So why did this occur? Why is there such a historic return of women to well, the House of Representatives, really. And so that's what I'm going to be focusing on in this portion. So I'm breaking it up here in terms of the candidate side and the voting patterns. And on the candidate side, I'm going to talk briefly about self-selection into candidacies as well as party recruitment. And then on the voting side, I'll talk about some patterns that we see in the 2018 midterms that favored either women or women and or Democrats. And I'm not going to draw close distinctions between those two right now. So one of the things that's quite noticeable about 2018 is the dramatic growth in candidacies compared to previous electoral cycles. So this shows us the number of women candidates in U.S. House primaries from 92 to 2018. And what we see in 2018 is humongous growth in Democrat women candidates. We don't see growth in, well, from the previous couple of electoral cycles in the Republican side, but it's nothing really different from the norm. So the Democrats nominated many more women candidates than they had before, and notably many more than the Republicans. So what explains this, right? Compared with years past, when women had to be actively recruited to run for office, there was a wave of women who volunteered for political office this cycle, an unusually high number, including many without traditional political credentials, which is relatively unusual in the American system. Indeed, Donald Trump has probably shown many women that prior political experience is not a prerequisite for office holding in the United States. And the Democrats were obviously the beneficiaries of this voluntary self-selection. There's also a recruitment issue, a long-term recruitment issue, on which the parties differ quite a bit. So the Republicans recruit far fewer women than the Democrats do. And this left-right party difference is actually common in most party systems, including in our own, in Canada. And there are ideological and strategic reasons for the partisan difference. I mean, on the ideological side, different party cultures and ideologies mean that Democratic elites are oriented towards political action by candidate gender or because of gender issues, while Republican elites don't tend to be. Recent research by Crowder, Meyer, and Cooperman shows, for example, that Democrat Party donors are far more likely than Republican Party donors to say that they're giving on account of candidate gender, or to say that gender issues are important to their decision to donate to candidates. And the gaps are really large here. Importantly as well, liberal women's political action committees, so like Emily's List, a very famous political action committee, are deeply woven into the fabric of the Democrat Party, while conservative women's political action committees are on the fringes of the Republican Party. So this gives the Democrats an advantage in helping to recruit, promote, and fund women candidates. So their connections basically with civil society, one could say, and well-heeled donors are much more integrated on the Democrat side than the Republican side. There's also a strategic issue here. Women candidates are actually also just a safer bet for Democrats than they are for Republicans. So this graph depicts the gender gap in win rates, so House candidates' win rates, the extent to which candidates who run win elections, and it separates it by party over time. The middle line in bold is the 0%, indicating no gender gap, right? Men and women win at the same rate. For the line above, which is the Republican line, it's positive, and in this case it shows that men win more often than women do when they run as candidates. And the line below the zero line is a negative gender gap favoring or not favoring men, showing that women win more than men do. So basically, women Democrats win more often than male Democrats do, while the reverse is true for Republicans. Male Republican candidates win more often than female Republican candidates. So in this context, too, it's not a surprise that the Democrat Party is more eager to recruit and nominate women than the Republican Party. Okay, so voters. I mean, obviously, it's not just a story about candidates. Voting patterns have something to do with election outcomes. And so I want to highlight, this is obviously not exhaustive. It's in a couple of minutes, but I want to highlight a couple of patterns that I think were key to the pink wave in this midterm cycle. First of all, the gender gap in vote choice grew quite a bit from 2016. It grew by about 8 percentage points. So to the extent that a lot of women, especially non-incumbent women, won their races, it was women voters that got them there. And women voters report being mobilized by women being on the ballot more than men do. So gender is part of the story here. But breaking it down, importantly, it's not just women generally. It's college-educated white women that are driving this gap. So we see quite a large jump in support for Democrat House candidates among college-educated white women compared to 2016. This segment of the electorate represents about 15% of the electorate, and so even small margins that favor Democrats among college-educated white women would have had an important impact on the electoral outcome in 2018. As you can see here too, there's really no movement among men in terms of the Democrat vote share in this campaign compared to House vote in 2016. And then there's also a growing generation gap among American voters, where the Democrat favoring young people are increasingly moving towards the left side of the political spectrum. Like if you see voters here, 18 to 39, huge jump in support for Democrat candidates in 2018 compared to 2016. And if we look at youth voters, I mean, they're mobilized by, I mean, in part, right? There's a lot that goes into explaining this generational gap and its growth over time, but they're mobilized by candidates like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who became a big story in this campaign and has remained really visible in the media ever since. And on the left here, we have a little thing that I picked off of Twitter that really has been making the rounds since the 2018 midterms, right? You know, sort of representation, an emoji representation of the Republican freshman class compared to the Democrat freshman class. The Democrats also focused a lot on issues that youth care about, like gun control and things like that. So, I mean, that was a winning move for the Democrats. And then for some of the other voters, like increasing the gender gap, especially among college-educated white women, healthcare turned out to be a really winning issue for Democrat candidates. And a focus on the Affordable Care Act and protections for pre-existing conditions and things like this may be important to the Democrats moving forward. So in terms of implications, and I'll just speak for a minute or two here, because this is, you know, a lot more speculative. In the next Congress, the literature predicts that we would actually get, in some ways, improved representation, governance, and institutional culture from a large cohort, especially of unconventional women candidates, coming in all at the same time. So the literature on legislators' behavior demonstrates that in certain contexts, women legislators are to the left of male legislators. They have less combative, more cooperative, less aggressive legislative and committee styles. They're more open to consensus building and cooperation. So it could be that we may see, especially welcome in a climate of political polarization and toxic political debate at times, we may see some improvements, which could be quite welcome. In terms of 2020, we're reminded that midterms don't predict presidential votes. So for example, Presidents Obama, Clinton, and Reagan had their butts kicked in their first midterms and then went on to win very strong mandates in the following presidential elections. But 2018 may reveal some vulnerabilities in the Trump coalition, especially when we're looking at so-called purple or swing or divided suburban districts that have a lot of college-educated white women in them. And then healthcare is obviously a vulnerability for the Trump coalition, right? The Republican repeal bill has been pretty unpopular, and the focus on pre-existing conditions has been a real, I guess, hot button issue for American voters. I mean, like with all sorts of entitlements in American politics, you know, people are skeptical or nervous when they're first brought in, but then they like them, right? And they start to, opinion starts to shift. And then the entrance of a really diverse and sort of fresh freshman class, I mean, it could potentially mobilize voters who see themselves reflected in Congress in a way that they never did before. The mobilization of voters may be even stronger following some of the ballot questions that were approved in the 2018 midterms, like the reenfranchisement of over 1 million felons in Florida, which is an important state for the presidential vote. So I'm going to leave things here and look forward to your questions.
Thanks very much. It's very nice to be here. I'll just say 3 quick things by way of introduction. One is that I'm very pleased to be at the School of Policy Studies at Queen's. Particularly pleased to see so many MPA students here. We may have a lot of problems with politics in our country, but a public service isn't one of them. We've got a great public service, and for those of you who are intending to go into it, thanks very much for doing that. It's a really an important career, and it's one that you can have a real impact on when you're well-trained, and this is a place where you'll be very well-trained. So nice to see all of you. Second thing I'll say very quickly is that it's always nice to be on the same bill as Elizabeth. Elizabeth and I were in grad school together 15 years ago. Incredibly, we were both 13 years old at that time, but it's really nice to have been a colleague and a friend of Elizabeth for so long. And the third thing is just by way of appreciation. I told Elizabeth before I got here that every time I've come to Queen's to give a talk, afterwards I would have a coffee with Ned Franks, and I would learn something about canoeing and something about Parliament. And I was very sad that Ned Franks passed on, and I just wanted to say that because he was a very kind person to me. I'm going to talk about American politics and try to avoid despondency, which is a state that one can get into when talking about American politics. I want to talk about 3 things, and as they link together. One is polarization in America at several levels. The second thing I want to talk about is gerrymandering and the larger legal edifice around the conduct of politics in America and the consequences of that edifice for American politics and also for trying to fix American politics. And then I want to highlight for you what I think are the most relevant societal cleavages and challenges that are facing America today. They matter for American politics, and I don't think that we have always a sufficient appreciation of their depth and their contours. And understanding them in a as sophisticated a way as possible helps us understand how American politics got to where it is and where we might go. And then I just have a few comments on, in a kind of a summarizing way, what I think the nature of the problem is within American politics right now, and that'll give you some indication of how I think it ought to be addressed or fixed. Here's a fact to begin with. Congress is polarized. Now, if you look at this chart, which I've taken from Nolan McCarty's work, this chart shows you polarization in the U.S. Congress, the House in the solid line, and the Senate in the dotted line, or the broken line, from 1877 to 2013. So there's maybe 3 things you might notice from this. One is that, first, American politics are very polarized today. So the higher you are on that y-axis, the more polarized you are. And polarization is you can just think of in this terms, in the following sense, that when a Congress is more polarized, Democrats are more likely to vote with Democrats and Republicans are more likely to vote with Republicans, and they're likely to vote differently. Okay? That's the first thing you might notice. The second thing you might notice is that those things are correlated. So if you think the entire story is gerrymandering, you're wrong, because of course you can't gerrymander the Senate, right? Because the districts are the state lines. And the third thing you might notice is that American politics may be remarkably polarized today, and indeed they are, and it's borne out by congressional behavior, but they've been very polarized in the past. In fact, the norm of that graph, if you look over the sweep of time from 1877 to 2013, and it's continued apace in its increase, is that most of the time American politics is polarized in Congress. It wasn't through the middle of the 20th century. There's a lot of thought about why that was the case. But the story is that American politics got to a point of quite appreciable consensus and non-polarization through the middle of the 20th century, and then it returned to what might be its normal equilibrium. Parties voting differently with fundamentally different views about the nature of society. I want to give you a sense, though, of what's driving that polarization. Let me just show you a few charts. Again, these are taken from my colleague Norman McCarty. So at the top is a graph that showed the partisan split when a vote on Medicare was brought to Congress by Lyndon Baines Johnson in 1965. What's the story from that? Well, the story is, first, there were a lot more Democrats in Congress than there were Republicans, if you add those bars up. But the more relevant story is the following, is that Republicans were more or less split on the issue of Medicare. The majority of Republicans voted against Medicare, but it was more or less an even split, and Democrats were firmly in favor of it. If you know your American politics, you may know among the Democrats who voted against Medicare where they were located. The South, it's a bit of a hint of what's going to come. But by the time health care reform came up in 2010, so-called Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act, the story there is that there were some Democrats who voted against it. They're that thin wedge of blue on the bottom right. But most Democrats voted for it, and all Republicans voted against it. That gives you a picture of what polarization looks like now compared to then. It's the same thing if we look at, for example, the Equal Opportunity Act. When that was brought to Congress again, driven or animated by the force of LBJ, in 1965, some Democrats vote against, most vote for it. And most Republicans voted for the Equal Opportunity Act in 1965. By the time the so-called Lilly Ledbetter Act comes up, which is in some ways a modern incarnation of the Equal Opportunity Act, almost all Democrats vote for, almost all Republicans vote against. Look at the Clean Air Act of 1963 versus cap and trade in 2010. It's the same story again. You can see where we're going here, right? Now, if you look back to those graphs, or if you added up the sums, what you may have noticed is that it's been an unequal shift between the two parties. One party has shifted more than the other. Which one? The Republicans. Now, that has a lot to do with geography. It has a lot to do with votes in the South shifting from Democrats to Republicans. But the story here is that the parties haven't been equal offenders in their polarization. One party's become more polarized than the other. One party's made a bigger shift away from its historical norms than the other. These are two important graphs, which are going to show the following. The graph on the left is going to show you the rise of income inequality and house polarization, starting in about 1947 and moving up. And you can see that those things are highly linked. That is, inequality at the level of income in the United States, measured via the Gini coefficient, has increased. So has polarization in the House of Representatives. I don't have to make any causal claims here about the causal ordering of those, I think, to still underline the importance of it. Those things are tracking quite closely together. If you take, for example, the share of the top 1% of income as another metric of American equality, and you overlay it on house polarization, you see the same pattern. Right? The story there that you see, though, is that it looks like there's a bit of a forerunner there and that income's running before polarization. But as inequality in the United States has increased, so has polarization. I'm going to come back to inequality when I talk about kind of the fundamental welter of problems that are facing American society. And there again, it's just House and Senate polarization running together. You can see that there was actually more variation between them in the past than now. It's the fourth notable thing about that exhibit. That the gap between House and Senate polarization was greater in the past, but now it runs together much more tightly. Media in America is polarized. So politicians are polarized, and media is polarized. Partially, this is a function of an exploded media market. It's also a function of demand. So it's cheaper to run media now than it was before. You don't have to broadcast anymore. You can effectively narrowcast if such a phrase is appropriate, and it's allowed for the polarization of media. And voters are polarized. So this chart's going to show you pretty remarkable polarization over just a short period of time. So we're getting into the realm of more complex exhibits now, but this is a relatively nice one. What you can see here is the distribution of people who vote Democratic and the distribution of people who vote Republican. And you can see their distribution on a measure of political ideology. So people's vote doesn't always line up with their ideology, but you can see that there's more alignment increasingly between how people vote and their self-identified ideology, but whether they're consistently liberal or consistently conservative. What's less apparent in this, so the main thing that we want to notice, right, is that the ideology of voters is diverging over time. What's a bit harder to take from this graph, but what is true, is that the variance is also collapsing, which is to say that voters themselves are more consistently liberal and more consistently Republican. One of the great findings of public opinion, right, from 50 years ago when Phil Converse looked at it was, he thought it was very curious that voters were, what he said, he called it unconstrained in their opinions. That if I knew your opinion on one issue, I didn't necessarily know it on another one. And that was a feature of public opinion. It's less and less a feature today. If I know your opinion on abortion, I know your opinion on same-sex marriage, on homosexuality as something that's morally correct or incorrect. But I also know your position on capital gains tax. You know, I mean, whatever Jesus thought about gay marriage, it doesn't necessarily, map onto how we thought about, accelerated deductibility or something like that, right? Okay. But voters are increasingly polarized. And here's the thing that I want to underline the most about this. I don't have an exhibit for you, but I'm going to give you an example which will illustrate it. Voters are also increasingly polarized in their views of each other. So there's been a lot of studies that have come out in the last couple of years documenting the behavioral consequences of partisanship. And those behavioral consequences are now extending down to how people treat one another. So if I put you in a behavioral economics game where I measure your concern for another person via allocations of money, if I do it in the United States, I'll find an increasingly widening partisan gap where people are more generous to co-partisans than they are people who are different from them. But the most interesting one in my mind is the following. In the United States, you can know how a person is registered to vote if you know their name, right? You know their name and their address, you can see where they are on the voter registry because there's this bizarre thing that when you vote, you have to register as Democratic or Republican or Independent in many states so you can participate in primaries. So a colleague at Stanford, Neil Malhotra and others have looked at this and have been able to match people's partisan registration to dating websites. And the thing that they find which is remarkable is that one of the biggest predictors of who people will be attracted to and will go out, will try to go out on dates with on dating websites, is the partisanship of the two people. When it matches up, they're much more likely to try to go on dates with one another. Now, I want you to think about how far, how much you need to know about it. I mean, people don't put, I don't know about these websites, but I don't think people put, I'm Republican right at the front of them, right? But so think about how much information people have to be conveying about their partisanship for you to be able to infer it to the level of it influencing your choice. That's how far political polarization extends in the United States. That it's guiding people's decisions about who they want to, perhaps spend their life with, but certainly who they want to have Congress with, to use a political term. So voters are clearly polarized. The media is polarized, and Congress is polarized. That's the first fact about American politics. The second is that the rules of American politics allow parties to set up the rules of the game in their favor. Now, just so you know the details of the way American partisan districting works, here are the two relevant facts. One is that the drawing of congressional districts for national elections is left to state legislatures. So the legislature of the state of Texas gets to draw out its congressional districts for national congressional elections in Texas. And the second thing is that that's done every 10 years after the census. So the Republican Party, knowing this was coming, put incredible efforts into getting control of as many state houses as possible through the 2000s so that they could engage in what they called, some people call it red map, but they could engage in, so that they could engage in the most partisan redistricting possible. Now, the parties here are not equal offenders, but neither of them have clean hands. The practice before 2011, in the main, was that state legislatures would draw out boundaries in a way that protected incumbents of the Republican or the Democratic Party. That was the deal, effectively. That when the state legislature in North Carolina was drawing districts, it would draw them out in a way that would protect the Republican and the Democratic incumbents in that state. When legislatures were overly partisan, sometimes they would draw it to their advantage. But the Republicans took enough control of state houses in the late 2000s that when the 2011 redistricting came up, they could get very serious about breaking that unsavory tradition and coming up with a new practice, which was to draw the most Republican lines possible. So there's just two figures here which make the point that we all know, which is that if you leave it to politicians to draw lines of boundaries, they'll come up with incredibly creative ways to do it. The exhibit on the left shows you how, when you've got some geographic distribution of voters, you can draw lines in ways that lead to different distributions. Okay? For those of you who are students of political history, you'll know that the picture on the right is what? It's Elbridge Gerry's salamander. So Elbridge Gerry was the governor of Massachusetts, and that shows the district that some of the districts that he famously had drawn in Massachusetts to ensure the re-election of his party. A newspaper cartoonist, satirist, noted that it looked like a salamander, hence Elbridge Gerry's salamander, hence gerrymandering, or if you want to say correctly, gerrymandering. Okay? That would be the etymologically correct way of pronouncing it, to be pedantic about it. But the point is that this has been left to politicians, and politicians have taken advantage of it. But it reflects a larger part of the American political edifice, which is that a very large number of decisions about the conduct of elections are left to state legislatures. And there's been more aggressive manipulation and pushing of those rules now than any time in the last 40 years. And that involves things like so-called felon disenfranchisement, so-called around the felon part, not around the disenfranchisement part. It involves things like allowing for terrible electoral administration practice, having elections well run in some counties, not in others, to the advantage of some parties over others. And at its extreme, it involves things like the North Carolina case, of taking a state that's basically split 50-50 in terms of underlying partisanship and drawing out congressional district boundaries in a way that will allow for something like a 12-4 Republican-Democratic split. Now, voters have pushed back on some of that, and I'll talk about that at the end of the talk, and courts have pushed back a little bit. But this is a fundamental fact about the administration of American elections, which is relevant. And finally, let me just say a few things about American society. It's becoming more unequal. It's becoming more unequal more quickly. So even at the second derivative, it's increasing. And it's doing it in a way which is leading to essentially unprecedented levels of inequality. So this is just showing you the income growth for people who are in the top 1% of earners, that's the red line, and the income growth for those who are in the bottom 90% of earners. Two facts to take from that graph. The line for the top 1% of income earners is getting bigger and bigger and bigger, so their income growth, the rate at which their income is growing, is getting higher and higher every year. And it's now surpassing that of the bottom 90%. But the other thing to take from that graph is the bottom 90% experienced great progress from the 40s through to the 70s in terms of the rate at which their income was growing, itself increasing. And that's flattened out pretty remarkably. The second thing is Americans are more indebted. It's hard to, you can do it ethnographically, one should experience it. It's hard to describe just how deep the experience of debt and indebtedness is in the United States. But it's a deeply indebted society. It's become increasingly so over the last 10 years of low interest rates. There's perhaps a reckoning coming. Manufacturing jobs are disappearing. So that graph will show you that in 1980 all the way to the left, there were 19 million people in manufacturing professions. It's now down to 12 million. For the most part, those professions were well-paying. They were regular and steady. They were places that often provided places of camaraderie and solidarity for the people who worked there, and now they're absent. That decrease is as attributable, we should note, as attributable to the offshoring of jobs, as attributable to automation as it is to the offshoring of jobs. Automation is not a new phenomenon. It's swept through large-scale American manufacturing during the 80s, and it's responsible for a very large share of the decline in manufacturing jobs in the United States. A lot of these jobs are union jobs. When they disappear, they're replaced by other professions that are non-unionized, which has great political implications. I'll finally just note this. I've been doing a lot of work lately on fear of automation and its relationship to populism and nativism. And what I show in these two graphs is the following. The graph on the left are people who are not nativists. These are respondents to a survey in the United States who don't hold anti-immigrant and anti-minority positions. Those in the right panel do. And you'll just note that those in the right panel are 20 plus 19. 39% of them are afraid or very afraid about robots replacing people in the workforce. In the left, it's just 20% of people. There's not a politician yet in the United States at a high level with a good degree of political creativity who's linking up fear of automation with populism and with nativism. But it's an underlying latent dimension that's just waiting for a political entrepreneur to wrap their head around it and to begin to exploit it or make use of it. And that person could be on the left or on the right. Finally, this comes from a paper by Ann Case and Angus Deaton, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And the story in this paper is the following. There's one group in the United States that has not experienced an increase in life expectancy over the last 20 years. What's that group? Basically white, middle-aged American men. The panel on the left shows you the mortality rate for people in France, Germany, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, Sweden. The story is that from 1990 to 2010, the mortality rate for adults in really every country in the West has declined. People are living longer, except for a middle-aged white man in the United States. And the exhibit on the right shows you, from 2000 to 2015, the number of deaths per 100,000 people attributable to different causes among white males in the United States. Look at chronic liver disease, look at suicides, gone from 15 per 100,000 to 25 per 100,000 in a 15-year period. And look at poisoning by alcohol. Went from something like 8 people in 100,000 to 30 people in 100,000 in a 15-year period. It's a social epidemic. Now, it happens to be centered around a group of people who we, by many metrics, rightfully think of as the most privileged people in society. But this is a story about a large segment of the United States population experiencing a deeply rooted social and epidemiological tragedy that, for the most part, isn't spoken to by the political class. This is a fundamental fact about the dynamics of the United States right now. It's only worse with the onset of the opiate crisis and the mass availability of painkillers and especially fentanyl-based drugs. I'll say two more things. One is that the youth won't save us. I apologize for this. But these are data from Catalyst. It's an American firm that uses voter rolls to basically do exit polling without exit polling. And the story is the following. If you look at the figure or the table on the left, that first row shows you the percentage of the electorate, the voters made up by 18 to 29-year-olds. So you can see in the 2018 midterms, 9% of people who voted were 18 to 29 years old. That's 1.5 or 2 points greater than it was in the midterms in 2014. So kudos to young people for turning out in greater numbers than before. But it's still the case that 63% of the American electorate in the 2018 midterms was made up of those aged 50 and over. There's not a lot of young people out there, right? There's a lot of old people. Those people in that narrow band from 18 to 29 will never match the huge swath of people who are age 50 and older. Now, that's not to get down on young folks, because I was once 18 to 29, but it is just to say that the mass of the electorate is still on the other side of the distribution. So let me just say something about what I think the natures of the problem are in the United States and the challenge of it for politics. The first is these problems are multi-causal. There's a whole bunch of things pushing them together. They're self-reinforcing. And if you're familiar with kind of Nassim Taleb's notion of anti-fragility, the idea that really effective systems are ones that when they're faced with a challenge, they don't only respond to the challenge, but they get stronger against it. They inoculate themselves against it. The worst parts of American politics are anti-fragile. So when people bring court cases against gerrymandering and against partisan districting or against voter enfranchisement, and they find ways to strike down laws, the response to the system isn't to say, great, you've tuned up our system. It's to say, let's find more creative ways to legislate in these terrible aspects of our system. The system is responsive and dynamic in negative ways. So don't think that a simple, a couple of initiatives that pass in 2018 to end gerrymandering are not going to be responded to. They will, and vigorously. The second is these problems are very multi-layered, right? They're geographic. They're about where people live. They're administrative, so they're about how laws and elections are run. They're social and political and psychological. They're deeply rooted within people in the United States, within where they live, within how they live their lives, and among whom they live them. They're problems that are fundamentally political, and they're going to continue to be. The solution to these problems, in my estimation, is not trying to think up, I hate to say it in front of you all, actually, kind of public administrative type solutions of just how can we administer elections a little bit better? How can we use technology to make elections more effective? It's not hard to actually run an election, eh? Like, it's not hard to have people mark things on a piece of paper and then count the ballots afterwards. There's a reason why it's not done that way. These are fundamentally political problems. And for people who are particularly on the Democratic side of the aisle, that means there need to be political solutions. That requires forbearance. It requires people, when they're in power, resisting the impulse to then just turn the system around to their own advantage. It requires tying yourself to the mast and not taking politically advantageous but amoral decisions. It involves long-termism, understanding that reforming politics is about doing it over the long term, doing things like consistently running more female candidates and training and recruiting and doing all the hard work years and years in advance. And it requires political creativity. It requires people who are, now what does that mean? It requires people who are fundamentally understand that they're going to have to operate within a political system and slowly change it. And hope that once you change something and you get it in place, that it has some logic that's self-reinforcing. Obamacare is just a fine example of it, right? The longer it's around, the harder it is to get rid of it. And it's almost been around long enough that it will be impossible to get rid of it once people cotton on to how well it works. So those are the problems with American politics. It's polarized. Its whole system and machinery of elections is manipulable. And it's overlaid on top of very fundamental problems within the United States, which are deep, they're long in their origins, they really matter to people's lives, and they animate people who are on your side of the political spectrum as much as they animate people who are on the other side of the political spectrum. And that means that they ought to be solved in a political way, not in any other fashion. Thanks very much.
Okay, great. We'll just move on to Slido now for some questions. The first is polarization an innately negative aspect of politics? Does consensus imply harmony? And I can start with Peter, perhaps?
Yeah, no, I'm not at all of the mind that polarization is undesirable on principle. I mean, I think that politics is about disagreement. It's nice when those disagreements are sometimes articulated, right? I think it can even make for good policy. It just seems unlikely to me. Given how complex people are and given how complex the world is, that the degree of polarization that we witness is natural, in the sense that I don't think there's so much political coherency that all of those things fit together, right? And if there were, it would be impossible for you to see the following, just really quickly. The percentage of Americans, the percentage of Republicans who thought that free trade was good policy a year ago was 50% lower than it was a year before that. The Republican consensus was that free trade was a good thing until the president said it wasn't, and then the Republican consensus was that it wasn't. Now that they've signed USMCA, again, they're of the mind that free trade is a good thing. That doesn't tell you about an articulate political philosophy. It tells you a well-articulated political philosophy. It tells you about people who are polarized and want to follow their political tribe along to whatever issue position it's taking.
Just to add on to that, so polarization need not be inherently problematic. In fact, there can be good reasons why an electorate can be strongly polarized, especially if the polarization is the product of like social cleavages or whatever, right? Mm-hmm. The problem with the US case, though, is that it's a specific kind of polarization, which is actually just hyper-partisanship.
Yes.
That is knee-jerk, that is sort of blind loyalty to a party label. And your example about Jesus's thoughts on like capital gains tax is a good one, right? And we also know that most Americans would never actually have any real opinion on capital gains tax because it's a complex issue on which they don't understand the ends or the means, right? But they're responding to cues, like blindly responding to cues from political elites who are increasingly motivated by, like legislating and acting on behalf of a base rather than the entire country or an entire district or whatever, right? So, I mean, I think the manifestation of polarization that we've seen in the American case at the federal level recently is highly negative and undesirable.
So next question. How can Canada protect itself against the effects of the polarization that is happening in the U.S.?
Elizabeth?
It's like, so you just like lob it over to me. Goodness. How can we protect ourselves? I mean, honestly, I don't know that we're actually in danger at the moment. I mean, I know there's a lot of talk about the growth of so-called like Trump-style populism in Canadian politics, and I mean, I don't know if that's actually true or whether its manifestations in the Canadian setting could be problematic or whatever. I mean, I know that our political institutions offer us, maybe some safeguards, right? So, like our party system, so our electoral rules, our political geography, and the social cleavages that define our political life at the national level sort of force winning parties to take broadly centrist positions on issues, especially on like valence issues, right? So it would be difficult to imagine highly sort of polarized situation with the two major parties at the federal level in Canada because, how would they sort of capture the amorphous middle? I mean, especially given that our party system, and there's a great book that's come out recently by Dick Johnston on the Canadian party system, and the title's escaping me at the moment, but it's Richard Johnston, you can look it up, where he's developed a theory of polarized pluralism is that right? Polarized pluralism? Right. Yeah, I think that's right. To talk about how not to get too technical, but like to talk about how the configuration of our national party system with a conservative party on the right, a New Democrat Party on the left, and then the liberals in the middle, how it encourages a sort of broad-based politics, where it's really difficult for one of the wings of the political party system to encroach too much into the center, and there's really not that much space for the liberals to sort of like move too far left or too far right. So I guess my point is that this configuration predicts a broadly centrist politics. I mean, I'd also make the observation that our mainstream conservative politics are actually not that conservative globally too, right? So in lots of ways, it's really challenging to compare the Canadian Conservative Party to the U.S. Republican Party. Anyway, I'm starting to ramble, so I'll stop there. But maybe that stimulated some ideas among Peter.
No, I think that it did. I mean, I'll just pick up right from that just by making two observations that are related. One is that I don't think we know enough about why conservatism has structured itself the way it has in Canada, but whatever one thought of the last Conservative government, they were one of only two Conservative parties when in power in democracies in the Western world which kept immigration rates at historically high levels. The other was Germany, and that has not worked out very well for Angela Merkel, though the exogenous circumstances were different for her. But just this week, Scott Morrison, the new Prime Minister of Australia, Liberal, which equals Conservative there, has announced they're going to reduce legal immigration to Australia by 25,000 people to ease off the pressure on transit and other infrastructure in Australian cities. Give me a break, right? Now, the Prime Minister before him was Malcolm Turnbull, who wouldn't have said such an absurd thing and was spilled by his party for that. And every day, Turnbull probably woke up and said, how did Harper pull that off in a similarly diverse, multicultural country, that he could maintain open borders for trade and could maintain very high levels of immigration. So there's something about our politics which makes it different. I think Mr. Scheer is trying to do a little bit of more populist stuff around rhetoric. I think he's He's running about 6 points off where he should be, and I think there's some relationship to that. So I wouldn't be overly concerned about it. I think that if I would say anything, just in conclusion about it, is that we have to do a lot of work, and this is something that policy students are very good at, I think, is in understanding what is actually unique about Canada and in rejecting the American narrative. The story of increasing inequality at the highest levels, at the 1%, especially the 1% of the 1%, is not a story that really carries in Canada. And that's because of a different tax system. So it's a policy response that has a different effect, and we ought to know that, right? Story of stagnant middle-class wages. For the most part, not really true over a 30-year time period. Different story than the United States, right? So getting the fact base helps us understand a little bit of why the politics are different. But we should be ever vigilant against, conmen, used car salesmen, electoral reform advocates, and political entrepreneurs, right? But beyond that, I think the system's working pretty well.
Before I move on with Slido, does anyone in the crowd have any questions?
A very nice presentation. My question is, why? And perhaps the answer would be, is it due to a shift in the digital world where you have massive information that will shift the politics and maybe fake news? Or is it the dollar, where you have the corporates dictating how government should be run, or even the corruption there? Or is it national or job security involvement? My last question here, how would you see the U.S. political landscape if Hillary Clinton was elected president?
So on the first questions, the first set, I think all those things can all be explanations for why American politics has gotten to the place that it's gotten to, that fundamentally those things all reinforce themselves. The ability to hear what you want on the news. It's not always fake news. It's just people hear the things they want to hear, right, and hear the facts that they want to hear. I think race is a major factor in this. I mean, the alignment of American politics on issues of race and on the ascriptive characteristics of voters underwrites a lot of the current polarization. That's a huge part of it. And the third thing I'll just say is that, and Elizabeth has heard me say this just this morning, the remarkable thing about being in the United States during an election is the amorality of it all. That you can sit in a room with Democrats who you would all like or Republicans who you would all like, and you'll hear people say things like, yeah, we've just raised $5 million for a political action committee or some 417 or whatever legal number they're using to describe their group. And I won't tell you where it's from, but we're using it to get voters to turn out for our side. And if you heard someone in Canada saying that, I've got $4 or $5 million, I've got $250,000 to engage in voter mobilization, but I can't tell you who it's from. For me, the amorality of it just washes over me. And it's just a system that's completely awash in money with no accountability. And we've been able to push that off, thankfully, in our case. I'll leave the Hillary Clinton question to you, how the world would be different.
No, that's a hard question, actually. What would be different if Hillary Clinton had won the presidency? I mean, I think we would have a lot more, I'm going to give kind of a boring answer, I guess, because, her platform wasn't, that revolutionary. I mean, she's a moderate Democrat. There would have, in my view, there would have been a lot of good policy initiatives and whatever, but we would have seen more continuity with the respect for institutions and the Constitution and respect for the way things are done in politics, and also in relations with civil society and the press and, so it wouldn't feel, like American politics wouldn't feel so despondent right now or in such crisis. Like, in fact, in many ways, she would have been quite a continuation, policy and governance-wise, from the Obama era, although she's obviously nowhere near as adored or sort of revered as Obama was. So we probably wouldn't be talking as much about American politics as we are today. I guess that's kind of boring, but that's what I would say. She's your sort of in many ways, your run-of-the-mill Democrat who, would have continued in that mold. Do you agree with that?
I do. There's a moment, there's a moment in The Sopranos, if you watch the show, where Meadow, the teenage daughter, has a party at the grandmother's house and wrecks the house. And Tony and Carmela, Tony the mob boss and Carmela's wife, ground her for a week. And that night they're in bed and they're talking to each other. And they say, Tony says, we got to be really careful here, because if she finds out that we're powerless, we're totally effed. And the story of American politics right now is that Trump has shown how powerless a bunch of institutions and norms and practices that we thought were powerful are. He bends under his will dozens and dozens of senators who are the strongest people you'll meet in your life, the most ambitious and the most practiced in their craft, and he bends them under his will. And he's going to try and bend under his will the Department of Justice. And he bent the Republican Party under his will. Part of it is money, and part of it is just people want to win. And they want to stay in office, and they think that running against Trump will keep them from office. And they don't want to admit that they're wrong. And it is a remarkable story about, we think institutions are strong until someone comes along and pays no heed to them. And the institutions don't know how to respond.
Well, part of it, too, is the polarization, right?
Yes,
so
yes.
So when both houses of Congress and the presidency are held by the same party in this climate, one will never be able to act as a proper check on the other.
That's right.
So,
That's right.
And this is like then,
Right.
because you would risk alienating the Republican base too much by being seen to attack someone from within your own party, right? And so in that sense, the sort of like foundational principles of the American Constitution have been subverted.
Yes.
Great. So I think that is all the time we have. But on behalf of everyone here, thank you both so much for being here with us today.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was good.